The hallways of Westbrook High School were like a maze of whispers and stares for Thomas. At 15 years old, he had grown somewhat used to the sideways glances, but they still stung. Thomas was born with Down syndrome, which gave him distinctive facial features, a shorter stature than most boys his age, and a way of processing the world that was uniquely his own. What many of his classmates failed to see was the gentle soul who noticed when someone dropped their pencil and always picked it up for them, or the boy who smiled at everyone despite how they treated him. "Look, it's the weird kid," someone whispered as Thomas walked to his locker. He pretended not to hear, but his shoulders hunched slightly under the weight of those words. He focused instead on remembering his locker combination, 14-27-9, repeating the numbers in his head like a protective chant. At lunch, Thomas sat at his usual spot at the far end of a table. He unpacked the lunch his mother had prepared, a peanut butter sandwich cut into 4 neat triangles, apple slices arranged in a circle, and a chocolate chip cookie. As he carefully laid everything out, a group of boys from the basketball team walked by. "Hey, dummy, did your mommy cut your sandwich for you?" one of them called out, high-fiving his friend. Thomas looked down at his sandwich, suddenly feeling childish and small. He didn't understand why the way his mother cut his sandwich should make anyone laugh. He liked the triangles, they were easier to hold, and it made eating more fun. But in that moment, he wished he could be invisible. A few tables away, Lily Chen, a quiet sophomore with kind eyes, watched the scene unfold. She had noticed Thomas before and had always meant to say hello, but somehow never found the courage. Seeing his downcast eyes as he stared at his lunch made something twist inside her chest. Back at home, Thomas lived in a different world. The modest 2-story house with blue shutters on Maple Street was his safe haven. Here there were no cruel whispers or mocking laughs. Instead, there were his parents, Elena and Robert Powell, who had built their lives around making sure their son knew he was loved exactly as he was. "How was school today, buddy?" Robert asked as Thomas dropped his backpack by the front door. Robert was still in his mail carrier uniform, having rushed home early to be there when Thomas arrived. "It was okay," Thomas said with a small shrug. It was his standard answer. He never told his parents about the names he was called or how lunch period often felt like walking through a minefield of potential humiliation. Elena appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes, the same warm brown as Thomas's, quickly scanned her son's face. After 15 years, she had become an expert at reading the subtle shifts in his expressions. "I made your favorite snack," she said, leading him to the kitchen where a plate of apple slices and caramel dip waited. "And then maybe you could practice piano for a bit before dinner." At the mention of piano, Thomas's face brightened. The old upright piano in the living room had been a yard sale find when Thomas was just 5 years old. Robert had brought it home thinking it might be fun for their son to bang on the keys. No one expected what would happen next. "Can I play the Moon Song?" Thomas asked, already heading toward the living room, his school troubles momentarily forgotten. "Of course," Elena smiled, exchanging a knowing glance with her husband. The Moon Song was Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece that had captured Thomas's heart when he heard it in a movie. What had started as random key pressing as a young child had evolved into something remarkable through years of patient practice. While Thomas struggled with reading and writing, he displayed an extraordinary ability to play complex pieces by ear after hearing them just a few times. Elena, who had taken piano lessons as a child but never excelled, had noticed her son's natural affinity for melody and rhythm early on. She had arranged for specialized piano lessons with Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly woman who lived down the street and had taught music for over 40 years. "He has a gift," Mrs. Abernathy had told Elena after just 3 lessons. "The way he feels the music, it's rare, even among typical children." As Thomas sat at the piano now, his fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment before descending. The first notes of Clair de Lune filled the living room, and as always, Elena felt tears prick her eyes. There was something about watching her son play that moved her beyond words. When Thomas played, all the things that made school difficult for him, his speech delays, his trouble with abstract concepts, his social awkwardness, seemed to fall away. At the piano, he was just a boy making beautiful music. Robert came to stand beside his wife, putting an arm around her shoulders as they listened. "I wish they could see him like this," he said quietly. Elena knew exactly who they were, the teachers who underestimated Thomas, the students who mocked him, the strangers who stared when they went shopping. They will, she said with a certainty she didn't always feel. Someday, they will. Later that evening, after dinner and homework, which always took Thomas longer than most kids his age, the family settled in for their nightly routine. Robert read aloud from a chapter book while Thomas leaned against his mother on the couch. These were the moments that helped balance the harder parts of their lives. "Dad?" Thomas asked during a pause in the reading. "Why don't people like me at school?" The question hung in the air, simple but devastating. Elena felt her heart break a little, as it had so many times before when confronted with the cruelty her son faced. Robert set the book down, choosing his words carefully. "Some people don't understand that different doesn't mean less, Thomas. They're afraid of what they don't understand. But I'm not scary," Thomas said, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "No, you're not scary at all," Elena assured him, pulling him closer. "You're wonderful. And the right people will see that. Mrs. Abernathy sees it, we see it, and others will too." What Elena didn't say was how much she worried, how she lay awake at night wondering if the world would ever be kind to her son. She didn't mention the meeting she'd had with the school principal just last week, where she'd fought back tears as she described the bullying Thomas experienced. The principal had been sympathetic but vague about solutions, talking about awareness programs that never seemed to materialize. The next morning, Thomas dressed for school with his usual care. He chose a blue button-up shirt because his mother once told him it matched his eyes. He combed his hair neatly to the side and made sure his shoes were tied the way Mrs. Abernathy had taught him, making bunny ears with the laces. As Thomas came downstairs for breakfast, Robert was already at the table reading the newspaper. "Looking sharp, bud," he said with a smile. Elena placed a bowl of oatmeal with sliced bananas and honey in front of Thomas. "There's a letter for you," she said, nodding toward an envelope next to his placemat. Thomas picked it up curiously. He didn't get much mail. Inside was a flyer for the school's annual talent show, happening in just 6 weeks. "All students welcome to showcase their special talents," the headline read. "I thought you might be interested," Elena said carefully, not wanting to push but unable to hide the hope in her voice. "You could play the piano." Thomas stared at the flyer, a mix of emotions crossing his face. "In front of everyone?" Robert lowered his newspaper. "Only if you want to, Thomas. No pressure." Thomas thought about playing his piano in the school auditorium, with all those eyes watching him, some of them belonging to the same people who called him names in the hallway. The idea made his stomach feel tight. But then he thought about how it felt to play, how the music seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him and flow through his fingers. When he played, he didn't feel different or slow or any of the things people called him. He just felt whole. "I'll think about it," he said finally, folding the flyer carefully and tucking it into his pocket. As Thomas boarded the school bus 20 minutes later, Elena watched from the front porch, sending up her usual silent prayer for a kind day. A day without tears or cruel words. She knew that Thomas had more to offer the world than most people realized, if only they could see past the things that made him different to the beautiful soul underneath. What she couldn't know was that the talent show flyer in Thomas's pocket would become the first page in a new chapter of their lives, one where the boy everyone mocked would leave them all speechless. The old upright piano in the Powell family living room had a history all its own. The dark wood was scratched in places, and one of the legs had been repaired with careful hands. Robert had found it at a yard sale when Thomas was just 5 years old, marked down to almost nothing because the previous owners couldn't afford to move it to their new apartment. "It's seen better days," the man selling it had said apologetically, "but the sound is still good." Robert, who knew nothing about pianos, had pressed a few keys and liked the warm tones that rang out. He thought perhaps it might be a fun thing for Thomas to bang on, a way to explore sounds and express himself when words were still difficult. Neither Robert nor Elena could have predicted what would happen next. Thomas's first meeting with the piano was like watching two old friends reunite. He approached it cautiously, his small fingers reaching out to touch the keys with a gentleness that surprised his parents. When he pressed down on a key and heard the note ring out, his entire face lit up with wonder. "Again, Thomas. Try another one," Elena had encouraged, delighted by his reaction. That first afternoon, Thomas had sat at the piano for nearly 2 hours, pressing keys one by one, sometimes combining them, His head tilted as he listened intently to each sound. It wasn't music yet, just exploration, but there was something in his focus that caught Elena's attention. Now, 10 years later, the piano had become Thomas's voice in many ways. On days when school had been particularly hard, when the words of his classmates cut too deep, Thomas would come home and head straight for the piano. His fingers would find the keys, and whatever was locked inside him would pour out through the music. Mrs. Abernathy, his piano teacher, often said she had never seen anything like it. "It's as if he can see the music," she told Elena during one of their after-lesson chats. Most students his age, most students of any age, have to work so hard to get the feeling right. But Thomas, the feeling comes first for him. The technique follows. The day after Thomas received the talent show flyer, Mrs. Abernathy came for his weekly lesson. She was in her 70s now, with silver hair always pinned in a neat bun and fingers that had grown somewhat stiff with arthritis, but still moved with grace across the keys. She had been teaching piano for over 40 years and had seen all types of students come and go, but Thomas held a special place in her heart. "So what shall we work on today?" she asked, settling onto the bench beside him. Thomas hesitated, then pulled the crumpled talent show flyer from his pocket and smoothed it out on top of the piano. "Mom thinks I should play in this." Mrs. Abernathy adjusted her reading glasses and studied the flyer. "The school talent show? That's a wonderful idea." "But everyone will be watching," Thomas said, his voice smaller than usual. "Everyone who laughs at me." Mrs. Abernathy was one of the few people outside the family who knew how difficult school was for Thomas. She had her own memories of being the odd one out as a child, being too tall, too bookish, too serious when others wanted to play. It wasn't the same as what Thomas faced, she knew, but it gave her a window into his hesitation. "Can I tell you a story?" she asked, turning slightly to face him. Thomas nodded. He liked Mrs. Abernathy's stories. They were usually about famous musicians or her own experiences as a young piano player. "When I was about your age, I was terribly shy," she began. "I could barely speak above a whisper in class. But when I played piano at my first recital, something strange happened. All those people watching didn't matter anymore. It was just me and the music. And afterward, people who had never noticed me before suddenly saw me, really saw me. Did they stop being mean to you?" Thomas asked. Mrs. Abernathy smiled gently. "Some did. Others took longer. But more importantly, I stopped caring so much about what they thought. I found something I loved, something that made me feel strong." Thomas considered this, his fingers absently tracing the edges of the flyer. "What would I even play?" "What do you want to play?" "What piece makes you feel the most?" Without hesitation, Thomas positioned his hands and began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was a piece they had been working on for several months, one with technical challenges that would impress any audience. But beyond that, it was a piece that seemed to speak Thomas's heart. Sometimes melancholy, sometimes hopeful, always beautiful. Mrs. Abernathy closed her eyes as she listened. Thomas played with a sensitivity that many trained musicians twice his age struggled to achieve. There were small technical errors, a rushed passage here, a slightly fumbled note there, but the essence of the piece came through so clearly that such details hardly mattered. When he finished, she opened her eyes to find him watching her anxiously. "That's your piece," she said simply. "That's the one." For the next few weeks, Thomas practiced with new determination. He still wouldn't commit to signing up for the talent show, but he worked on the Nocturne as if his life depended on perfecting every note. Elena would often pause in the doorway of the living room, watching her son lose himself in the music, his face showing expressions she rarely saw at other times: confidence, peace, even joy. One evening, as Thomas repeated a particularly difficult section, Elena sat down beside Robert on the couch. "He's getting really good at that piece," Robert observed quietly. Elena nodded. "Mrs. Abernathy says it's college level. Most kids his age couldn't play it. Do you think he'll actually do it? The talent show?" Elena watched as Thomas closed his eyes, swaying slightly as his fingers danced across the keys. "I hope so, but I'm trying not to push. It has to be his choice." The deadline to sign up for the talent show was approaching. Each morning, Elena would gently remind Thomas, and each time he would say, "I'm still thinking." She understood his fear. The stage would be bright, the audience large, and many of those watching would be the same kids who had made school a daily challenge. Then one evening, Thomas came home from school with a strange expression on his face. He was quiet during dinner, pushing his food around more than eating it. "Everything okay, buddy?" Robert asked as they cleared the table. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He carried his plate to the sink, then turned to face his parents. "Lily Chen talked to me today." Elena and Robert exchanged surprised glances. Thomas rarely mentioned interactions with classmates that didn't involve teasing. "That's nice," Elena said carefully. "What did she say?" "She sits behind me in math class. She said she heard me humming while I was doing my worksheet. She asked if I like music." Thomas's words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them in. "I told her I play piano, and she said her brother plays violin. Then she asked if I was doing the talent show." "And what did you say?" Robert asked. "I said I didn't know yet." Thomas took a deep breath. "She said I should do it. She said she'd come watch me and clap really loud." Something warm bloomed in Elena's chest. This was what she had hoped for. Someone at school to see Thomas as more than just his diagnosis. Someone to see the person he was beneath the differences that others mocked. "She sounds like a nice girl," she said. Thomas nodded. "She is. She never laughs when I take longer to answer questions in class." After dinner, Thomas went straight to the piano. Instead of practicing the nocturne, however, he pulled out a blank form from his backpack, the talent show registration. "I think I want to do it," he said, looking up at his parents with a mix of fear and determination. "I'm scared, but I want to show them what I can do." Elena felt tears prick her eyes as she helped Thomas fill out the form. For years, she and Robert had tried to protect him from a world that could be cruel to those who were different. But perhaps, she thought as she watched him carefully print his name on the form, protection wasn't always what he needed most. Perhaps what he needed was the chance to show his strength. The next morning, Thomas handed the completed form to Ms. Rivera, the music teacher who was organizing the talent show. She raised her eyebrows when she saw what he planned to play. "Chopin? That's quite ambitious," she said, her tone making it clear she had doubts. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something simpler?" Thomas felt his confidence waver under her skeptical gaze. But then he remembered what Mrs. Abernathy had told him during their last lesson. Music speaks when words fail. And there were so many things he wanted to say to his classmates, to his teachers, to everyone who had ever underestimated him. "I'm sure," he said quietly but firmly. "I can play it." Ms. Rivera still looked doubtful, but she added his name to the list. "The show is in 3 weeks. You'll have 5 minutes for your performance." As Thomas walked away, he could feel his heart pounding. What had he just done? The thought of sitting at a piano in front of the whole school made his palms sweat and his stomach twist. But another feeling was growing alongside the fear, a tiny spark of excitement. For once, people would see him doing something he was good at, really good at. That afternoon, when he sat down at his piano at home, Thomas played with new purpose. Each note of the nocturne seemed to carry a message. This is who I am. This is what I can do. And for the first time, others would hear it too. The 3 weeks before the talent show passed in a blur of practice and growing nerves for Thomas. Every day after school, he would rush home and head straight to the piano, sometimes not even stopping to have his usual snack. The nocturne had become more than just a piece of music to him. It was his voice, his chance to be heard. "Remember to breathe," Mrs. Abernathy reminded him during their lessons, noticing how he would sometimes hold his breath during the most challenging passages. "The music needs to breathe, and so do you." At school, things were mostly the same. The boys who had always mocked him continued their taunts, though Thomas found they bothered him a little less now. He had something to look forward to, something that made him feel like more than just the boy with Down syndrome. Occasionally, he would catch Lily Chen's eye in math class, and she would give him a small smile of encouragement. One day after class, she approached his desk while he was still packing up his books. "How's your practice going?" she asked, her voice soft but friendly. Thomas felt his cheeks warm slightly. He wasn't used to classmates talking to him with genuine interest. "It's good. I practice every day." "Tinks, my brother says that's the secret," Lily nodded. "He practices his violin for hours. It drives our parents crazy sometimes." She laughed, and Thomas found himself smiling too. "What's the piece you're playing again?" "Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major," Thomas said, the name rolling off his tongue with the familiarity of a favorite story. Lily's eyes widened slightly. "Wow, that's a hard one. My brother played a Chopin piece for his recital last year, and he said Chopin is really difficult. Thomas shrugged, not wanting to seem boastful, but secretly pleased by her reaction. I like how it feels to play it. As the talent show drew closer, Ms. Rivera organized a rehearsal for all the participants. Thomas arrived at the school auditorium with his parents, his stomach in knots. He had never played on the school's piano before, and he worried it would feel different from the familiar touch of his piano at home. The auditorium was mostly empty, with just a few teachers and the other performers scattered throughout the seats. Ms. Rivera sat in the front row with a clipboard, checking off names as each student took their turn on stage. There were singers, dancers, a boy who did tricks with a yo-yo, and a group who performed a scene from a play. Thomas watched them all, his anxiety growing as his turn approached. Everyone seemed so confident, so at ease in the spotlight. When Ms. Rivera called his name, Thomas felt his legs shake as he walked to the stage. The school piano was a grand piano, much larger than his upright at home. He sat on the bench, which felt higher than he was used to, and placed his fingers on the keys. They felt colder, smoother than his piano. Whenever you're ready, Ms. Rivera called from her seat. Thomas took a deep breath and began to play. The first few notes came out hesitantly, and he winced at a wrong note in the opening measure. The unfamiliar piano and the empty vastness of the auditorium were throwing him off. Stop, stop, Ms. Rivera interrupted. Thomas, are you sure this piece isn't too advanced for you? There's no shame in choosing something simpler. Thomas felt his face burn with embarrassment. He looked out at the handful of people watching and saw his parents' concerned faces. Mrs. Abernathy's frown of disapproval aimed at Ms. Rivera, and to his surprise, Lily Chen sitting near the back, who must have come in while he was focused on the piano. I can play it, he said, his voice stronger than he felt. I just need to get used to this piano. Can I try again? Miss Rivera sighed but nodded. All right, one more try. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, imagining he was in his living room with just the piano and himself. When he opened them again, he kept his gaze fixed on the keys, shutting out everything else. This time, his fingers found their rhythm and the nocturne began to flow. It wasn't his best performance, the unfamiliar piano still threw him off in places, but the heart of the music came through. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before he heard clapping. Looking up, he saw Mrs. Abernathy on her feet, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. His parents quickly joined in, and even Ms. Rivera looked impressed. Well, she said, making a note on her clipboard. That was much better. Just make sure you practice more on this piano before the actual show. I can arrange for you to come in during lunch periods if you'd like. Thomas nodded gratefully. As he left the stage, Lily gave him a thumbs up from her seat, and he felt a small surge of confidence. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be a disaster. For the next 2 weeks, Thomas spent every lunch period in the auditorium, practicing on the grand piano. Sometimes Lily would come watch, sitting quietly in the back row, occasionally offering words of encouragement. Thomas had never had a friend at school before, and he wasn't sure if that's what Lily was becoming, but her presence made the lunch periods feel less lonely. The night before the talent show, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, his mind racing through the nocturne, his fingers twitching slightly as they played invisible keys on his blanket. What if he messed up? What if people laughed? What if this whole thing was a terrible mistake? His bedroom door creaked open and Elena peeked in. Can't sleep? She asked softly. Thomas shook his head. She came in and sat on the edge of his bed. That's normal before a big performance. Even professional musicians get nervous. What if I make mistakes? Thomas whispered, giving voice to his biggest fear. Elena smoothed his hair back from his forehead, a gesture that had comforted him since he was small. Then you make mistakes. It happens to everyone. But here's something Mrs. Abernathy told me once. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about making people feel something. But what if they laugh at me? Elena was quiet for a moment, and Thomas could see her searching for the right words. Some might, she admitted finally. There are always going to be people who don't understand or who are unkind. But there will be others who will really hear you, who will see what I see every time you play, something beautiful. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. It was dark blue with flecks of silver that caught the dim light from his bedside lamp. I found this on the beach during our vacation last summer. I've been saving it for a special occasion. She placed it in Thomas's palm. It's a worry stone. When you're feeling nervous tomorrow, hold it in your pocket and rub your thumb over it. It might help. Thomas closed his fingers around the stone, feeling its cool weight in his hand. Thanks, Mom. The morning of the talent show dawned clear and bright. Thomas went through his day in a fog, barely hearing his teachers, his mind constantly returning to the evening ahead. The worry stone remained in his pocket, and he found himself reaching for it whenever his anxiety peaked. At lunch, he went to the auditorium for one final practice session. As he played, he tried to pour all his nervous energy into the music, letting it flow through his fingers and out into the empty room. When he finished, he heard a single person clapping and turned to see Mrs. Abernathy walking down the aisle toward the stage. "That was beautiful, Thomas," she said, her eyes bright with pride. "I came by to wish you luck tonight, but after hearing that, I don't think you need it." "I'm still scared," he admitted. Mrs. Abernathy nodded, understanding. "Of course you are. But being brave isn't about not feeling fear. It's about feeling it and doing the thing anyway." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small box. "I have something for you." Inside the box was a simple pin in the shape of a piano. "I give these to all my students before their first major performance," she explained. "It's a tradition." She pinned it to his shirt collar. "There, now you're ready." By the time evening came, Thomas felt like his heart might beat right out of his chest. The auditorium was filling up with parents, teachers, and students. Backstage, the other performers were running through last-minute preparations. Singers warming up their voices, dancers stretching, the yo-yo boy practicing his tricks. Thomas stood apart from the others, the worry stone clutched in one hand, his other hand touching the piano pin for reassurance. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see the audience. His parents were sitting in the middle section, looking both nervous and excited. A few rows behind them, he spotted Lily sitting with a boy who looked enough like her to be the brother she had mentioned. The lights dimmed, and Ms. Rivera walked onto the stage to welcome everyone and introduce the first act. The talent show had begun, and Thomas was scheduled to perform last. He watched the other performances from the wings, trying to stay calm as his turn grew closer. Finally, Ms. Rivera announced, "And our final performer tonight is Thomas Powell, who will be playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major on the piano." There was polite applause as Thomas walked onto the stage. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him as he made his way to the piano. Just before he sat down, he heard someone in the audience whisper loudly, "Isn't that the Down syndrome kid?" This should be good. A few chuckles followed, and Thomas froze, his confidence wavering. But then he felt the worry stone in his pocket and saw the piano pin catching the stage lights. He thought of all the hours of practice, of Mrs. Abernathy's belief in him, of Lily's encouragement, of his parents' unwavering support. He sat down at the piano, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. It was time to show everyone who he really was. The moment Thomas's fingers touched the keys, something magical happened. The whispers, the stares, the bright lights, the crowded auditorium, all of it faded away until there was nothing but Thomas and the piano. His hands, which had sometimes trembled during practice, now moved with confidence across the keys as the first gentle notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the air. For the first few measures, the audience continued to shift and whisper. Thomas could sense their skepticism, the same doubt he had faced his entire life. But as the piece progressed and the melody began to soar, an unusual hush fell over the room. Even those who had come expecting to be amused by his attempt were caught off guard by the beautiful sounds coming from the piano. In the third row, Elena gripped Robert's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had heard Thomas play this piece countless times at home, but tonight was different. There was an emotion in his playing that she had never heard before, a mixture of longing, hope, and quiet determination that brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't just about showing off a skill. This was Thomas telling his story through music, speaking in a language everyone could understand. On stage, Thomas reached the middle section of the Nocturne, where the music grows more complex and demanding. His teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, leaned forward in her seat, her lips moving silently with the rhythm of the piece, her eyes never leaving Thomas's form at the piano. She had worked with many talented students over her decades of teaching, but few had the natural connection to music that Thomas possessed. While others played the notes, Thomas lived them. As the piece built toward its emotional peak, Thomas closed his eyes. letting his fingers find their way from memory and feeling. In this moment, he wasn't a boy with Down syndrome, wasn't the kid who struggled with reading and got confused by abstract math problems, wasn't the target of cruel jokes in the school hallways. He was simply a musician speaking through his art. In the audience, a PE teacher who had always been impatient with Thomas's slower pace during gym class found himself holding his breath. A group of boys who had laughed at Thomas that very morning exchanged glances of disbelief. Near the back of the auditorium, the school principal, who had heard Elena's concerns about bullying but had done little to address them, watched with growing amazement as the boy many had underestimated filled the room with extraordinary music. Lily Chen, sitting with her brother, felt a swell of pride as she watched her new friend transform before everyone's eyes. She had heard him practice during lunch periods, but this performance had a depth and confidence she hadn't witnessed before. Her brother, a serious music student himself, leaned over to whisper, "He's really good. Like really good." When Thomas reached the final gentle section of the piece, the auditorium was completely silent. Every cough, every shuffle, every whisper had ceased. All eyes were on the boy at the piano whose fingers danced across the keys with both technical skill and profound feeling. As the final notes hung in the air, there was a moment of pure stillness, as if everyone present was holding their breath, not wanting the spell to be broken. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone began to applaud. The sound was quickly joined by another pair of hands, then another, until the entire auditorium erupted in thunderous applause. Several people rose to their feet, and soon the entire audience followed, giving Thomas a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls of the building. Thomas opened his eyes, momentarily confused by the response. He had been so lost in the music that he hadn't noticed the transformation that had taken place in the room. Now, looking out at the sea of standing people, many with tears in their eyes, he felt a strange new feeling wash over him. Pride, unmingled with shame or doubt. For perhaps the first time in his life, people weren't clapping because they felt they should, or because they were surprised he could do something despite his disability. They were applauding because he had genuinely moved them. Ms. Rivera appeared at his side, her clipboard forgotten as she helped him stand and take a bow. "That was incredible, Thomas," she said, her earlier skepticism completely gone. "Absolutely incredible." Thomas bowed once, then again as the applause continued. He found his parents in the crowd, his mother openly crying, his father trying to discreetly wipe away tears of his own. Near them stood Mrs. Abernathy, beaming with pride. And there was Lily, clapping wildly and smiling so broadly it looked like her face might split in two. When the applause finally began to die down, Thomas made his way off the stage on legs that felt oddly shaky. In the wings, several of the other performers patted him on the back or gave him thumbs-up signs. The yo-yo boy, who had won the talent show the previous year, shook his hand and said, "Dude, that was awesome." Thomas didn't have time to process these reactions before his parents reached him, wrapping him in a group hug that felt safe and warm and perfect. "You were amazing," Elena whispered, still crying happy tears. "I've never heard you play like that before." "I'm so proud of you, buddy," Robert added, his voice thick with emotion. "So incredibly proud." Mrs. Abernathy appeared next, her eyes shining. "Thomas Powell," she said formally, though her voice quivered slightly, "it has been one of the great privileges of my teaching career to work with you." She pressed a kiss to his forehead, something she had never done before. Chopin himself would have been moved. As the crowd began to disperse at the end of the show, something unexpected happened. People Thomas barely knew, teachers from other grades, parents of other students, classmates who had never spoken to him before, came up to congratulate him. Some admitted they had no idea he could play like that. Others asked how long he had been taking lessons. A few simply wanted to shake his hand. One of these people was Mr. Richards, the school principal. "Thomas," he said, extending his hand, "that was a remarkable performance. Truly remarkable. You have an extraordinary gift." "Thank you," Thomas replied, still somewhat dazed by all the attention. "I wonder," Mr. Richards continued, looking thoughtful, "if you might consider playing at our school assembly next month? We're focusing on hidden talents, and I think you'd be the perfect example." Before Thomas could answer, he noticed a small group approaching, 3 boys who had been among his most frequent tormentors. For a moment he tensed, wondering if they had come to find some way to spoil this perfect evening. But their usual swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. The tallest of them, a boy named Jason who had once stuck a "kick me" sign on Thomas's back, stepped forward. "Hey," he said, shuffling his feet slightly. "That was really cool. I didn't know you could play like that." "Thanks," Thomas said cautiously. "Where did you learn to do that?" asked another boy, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I've been taking lessons since I was 5, Thomas explained. My teacher is Mrs. Abernathy." He gestured toward her and she gave a small wave. "Cool," said the third boy, nodding. "Really cool." They didn't say more and soon wandered off to join their parents, but Thomas felt something shift in that brief exchange. They had seen him, really seen him, perhaps for the first time. As the auditorium emptied, Lily approached with her brother in tow. "Thomas, this is my brother David. He plays violin, remember? He wanted to meet you." David, who looked to be about 17, shook Thomas's hand firmly. That was seriously impressive. "I've been working on a Chopin piece myself, and it's kicking my butt." "You made it look easy," Thomas smiled shyly. "It's not easy. I practice a lot. It shows," David said. Then, with the directness of a fellow musician, he added, "Some of us get together to play chamber music on Sundays at our house. We could use a good pianist. Would you want to join sometime?" Thomas looked at his parents, surprise and hope written across his face. Elena nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that," Thomas said. As they finally left the school that night, Thomas felt different. He was still the same person he had been that morning. Still had Down syndrome, still struggled with the same things, still had the same strengths and weaknesses. But something fundamental had changed in how others saw him, and perhaps more importantly, in how he saw himself. In the car on the way home, Thomas was unusually quiet, processing all that had happened. Elena glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "What are you thinking about, sweetie?" Thomas considered the question for a moment. "I'm thinking about tomorrow," he said finally. "What about tomorrow?" Robert asked. Thomas looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "I'm thinking it might be different." Elena and Robert exchanged a glance, understanding the weight of that simple statement. For so long they had worried about Thomas's future, about a world that often failed to see beyond labels and differences. Tonight had been just one evening, one performance, and they knew that not everything would suddenly be perfect. But a door had opened, a door to a future where people might see Thomas first and his disability second, rather than the other way around. "I think you're right," Elena said softly. "I think tomorrow will be different." And as they pulled into their driveway, the old upright piano waiting inside their home no longer seemed like just an instrument. It had become a bridge, a way for Thomas to connect with a world that had often felt closed to him. Through music he had found his voice, and for the first time in his life, people had really listened. The weeks following the talent show brought changes to Thomas's life that no one could have predicted. The morning after his performance, he had walked into school with his shoulders slightly hunched, half expecting everything to go back to normal. The whispers, the stares, the occasional cruel comment. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of Westbrook High. As Thomas made his way to his locker, several students nodded or waved at him. A girl from his English class smiled and said, "Great job last night." The usual group of boys who lingered near the water fountain to mock passing students were still there. But when Thomas walked by, the tall one, Jason, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't as if all the challenges of being different had suddenly vanished overnight. Thomas still struggled with certain subjects, still needed extra time for tests, still had moments when his speech was difficult to understand when he got excited or nervous. But for the first time, these differences seemed less important to those around him. In math class, Lily slid into the seat next to Thomas instead of behind him. "Is this okay?" she asked, and when he nodded, she smiled. "David hasn't stopped talking about your playing. He told his violin teacher about you." At lunch, Thomas headed to his usual isolated spot, but before he could sit down, he heard someone call his name. Looking up, he saw Lily waving from a table where she sat with a few other students. "Come sit with us," she called. Thomas hesitated, his lunch tray heavy in his hands. He had spent so many years eating alone that the prospect of joining a group was both thrilling and terrifying. But something about the applause still ringing in his ears from the previous night gave him the courage to walk over. "This is Thomas," Lily introduced him to the others at the table. "He's the one who played Chopin at the talent show." That was amazing. said a boy with glasses who Thomas recognized from his science class. "I play guitar, but nothing like what you did." "My mom cried during your performance," added a girl with braces. "She plays piano too, but she said she couldn't do what you did." As the conversation continued, Thomas found himself included in a way he had never experienced before. People asked him questions and waited for his answers. They laughed at his shy jokes. They treated him like he belonged. That afternoon, when Thomas arrived home, Elena immediately noticed something different in his expression. "Good day?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual though her heart was hopeful. "Yeah," Thomas said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It was good." Elena and Robert exchanged glances of cautious optimism. One good day didn't erase years of struggle, but it was a start, a crack in the wall that had kept their son separate from his peers for so long. The next surprise came a few days later, when Mr. Richards, the school principal, called Elena to discuss an idea. The spring concert for the district was approaching, an event that featured select students from all the schools in the area. Typically, students had to audition for months in advance, but Mr. Richards had spoken to the organizers about making an exception for Thomas. "They've agreed to include him after seeing a video of his talent show performance," Mr. Richards explained. "If he's willing, that is." When Elena relayed the invitation to Thomas, she watched his face carefully. "It's completely your choice," she assured him. "No pressure either way." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, rolling the blue worry stone between his fingers, a habit he had developed since the talent show. "Would there be a lot of people?" he finally asked. "Yes," Elena answered honestly. "It's held at the community center. Usually a few hundred people attend." Thomas nodded slowly, considering this. "Can Mrs. Abernathy help me prepare?" "I'm sure she'd be thrilled to." And so a new routine was established. 3 times a week, Thomas worked with Mrs. Abernathy, preparing a slightly more challenging piece, Debussy's Clair de Lune, the moon song he had loved for years. On Sundays, he joined Lily's brother David and his friends for chamber music sessions, where he was initially shy but gradually became more comfortable. At school, the change in how others treated Thomas continued. It wasn't perfect. There were still occasional hurtful comments, still moments of frustration or misunderstanding. But increasingly, Thomas found himself included rather than excluded, seen for his abilities rather than only for his disabilities. Perhaps the most meaningful change came in Thomas himself. The boy who had once tried to make himself invisible in the school hallways now walked with his head a little higher. The student who had rarely raised his hand in class now occasionally volunteered answers, even if he wasn't completely sure they were right. The child who had once defined himself by what he couldn't do was beginning to see the vastness of what he could. One evening, about a month after the talent show, Thomas was practicing Clair de Lune while Elena prepared dinner. The haunting, beautiful melody filled their home, and Elena found herself pausing in her work to listen. There was something different in Thomas's playing now, a confidence, a maturity that hadn't been there before. When he finished the piece, she went to stand in the doorway of the living room. "That was beautiful, Thomas." He looked up with a small smile. "I think I'm ready for the concert." The night of the district concert arrived on a mild spring evening. The community center was packed with parents, teachers, and students from all across the district. Backstage, Thomas sat quietly among the other performers, his blue worry stone in one pocket and Mrs. Abernathy's piano pin on his collar. "Nervous?" asked a tall girl with a flute case who was sitting next to him. "A little," Thomas admitted. "Me too," she said. "I'm Grace, by the way. I'm from Lakeside High. I'm Thomas Westbrook." "Oh." Grace's eyes widened with recognition. "You're the piano player everyone's been talking about. My music teacher showed us a video of you playing Chopin. It was really beautiful." Thomas felt a flush of surprise. "People have been talking about me?" "Definitely. There's a guy in our jazz band who has a younger brother with autism. He said your performance made his mom cry because it reminded everyone that labels don't define what someone can do." Before Thomas could respond to this unexpected information, the backstage manager came to tell them it was almost time. Grace wished him luck before going to take her position, leaving Thomas to process what she had said. It had never occurred to him that his playing might mean something to people he had never even met. When it was Thomas's turn to perform, he walked onto the stage with steadier steps than he had at the talent show. The audience was larger, the lights brighter, but the fear that had once paralyzed him had been replaced by a nervous excitement. As he sat at the grand piano and positioned his fingers above the keys, he took a deep breath and began to play. Clair de Lune filled the community center, delicate, dreamlike, and deeply moving. Thomas played with the assurance of someone who had found his purpose, his fingers bringing to life the shimmering moonlit quality that had given the piece its name. In the audience, Elena and Robert watched with hearts full of pride and gratitude. Beside them sat Mrs. Abernathy, her eyes closed as she absorbed every note. A few rows back, Lily and her family, including brother David, listened in appreciative silence. When the final notes faded, the audience once again rose to their feet in applause. Thomas took his bow, a smile spreading across his face as he found his family in the crowd. This time the applause didn't surprise him. This time he understood that he had earned it. After the concert, as people mingled in the community center's lobby, a man approached Thomas and his parents. He introduced himself as Professor Alan Wilson from the local community college's music department. "That was a remarkable performance," he said to Thomas. "I wonder if you've ever considered taking classes at our Saturday music program for gifted young musicians." As Elena and Robert discussed the details with Professor Wilson, Thomas noticed a young boy watching him from a short distance away. The boy, who appeared to be about 7 or 8, had features that suggested he might also have Down syndrome. Beside him stood a woman who was clearly his mother, her hand on his shoulder. When she noticed Thomas looking their way, she smiled and encouraged her son to come forward. "Go ahead, Peter," she said gently. "You can say hello." The boy approached shyly, his mother following close behind. "I liked your music," he said, his words coming slowly but clearly. "Thank you," Thomas replied, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. "Peter has been taking piano lessons for 6 months now," his mother explained, her eyes bright with emotion. "When we heard about your performance at the talent show, and then about tonight's concert, we had to come. I wanted him to see—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I wanted him to see what's possible." Thomas knelt down so he was at eye level with Peter. "Do you like playing piano?" he asked. Peter nodded earnestly. "It's hard sometimes. My fingers don't always go where I want." "Mine don't either sometimes," Thomas confessed. "But it gets easier with practice. Will I be able to play like you someday?" Thomas thought about all the hours at the piano, all the frustration and joy, all the moments when music had been his voice when words failed. "Maybe," he said honestly. "Or maybe you'll play in your own way. That's even better." As Thomas stood to rejoin his parents, Peter's mother touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said, and Thomas understood she wasn't just thanking him for talking to her son. Later that night, as Thomas lay in bed reviewing the events of the evening, he thought about Peter and his mother. He thought about Grace's comment about the jazz band member and his brother. He thought about Lily and their growing friendship, about David and the chamber music group, about Professor Wilson and the Saturday music program. 6 weeks ago, he had been the boy everyone mocked, the boy defined by what made him different, the boy who ate lunch alone and kept his head down in the hallways. Now he was still Thomas with Down syndrome, but he was also Thomas the pianist, Thomas the friend, Thomas who had something to give. As he drifted toward sleep, Thomas realized that music hadn't just given him a talent to share. It had given him a way to connect. A bridge between his world and everyone else's. And on that bridge, he was finding his way forward 1 note at a time.